So today we're changing the brake pads and rotors on a 2003 Miata. Disc brakes across the board are pretty similar to each other. Few little differences between cars, but this will give you an idea. Of course, we've got to start by removing the tire. And then we'll go over what bolts we need to take off to take the pads and brake rotors off by removing the caliper. I'm going to put the tire under here for a little safety measure. Can't be too safe. Okay, you can. All right, so these are 14s on this particular vehicle. This is what removes the caliper, so you can kind of lift it, get it out of the way. It's attached with this line, which goes to the, this is the brake line. So you want to remove these two bolts. Y'all guys missed it. I was trying to break them loose so you wouldn't have to wait on me, and I just broke a bolt. So this is one of the sliders. It's not a huge deal. We can be replaced. But essentially, you're going to remove these two bolts right here. There's one on top, one on bottom. As I said, they're already loose. And this is what it looks like when it's not broken. Just a little screw. And then this whole thing comes out. So this is your caliper with your piston that actually pushes on the pads. You want to put it somewhere where it's not going to put strain on the hose. And then these are your sliders. This is what actually kind of helps move the caliper and piston around. So this is what broke in here. We can fix it by replacing that one bolt and putting it back. So it's not the end of the world. You're also going to want to lube these bolts here, these sliders, so they can move freely. But essentially what you've done by removing it, if you don't have a bolt brake, is you want to be careful with these boots. That's what protects it from getting dirt in here. So you want to keep these boots intact, and then put some grease on here, some brake grease or lube. So we removed it, supported it, and here's your brake pads. We're going to take these little clips out, and let's move these little pads out. They just slide right on in. And you can see how worn they are. They're down to almost metal. And if you were to just change the pads, a good idea is to resurface the rotors, so that when you put the new pads in, they're going to have a slightly different surface to the rotor, and it may actually cause your brakes to vibrate. So it's always a good practice to remove the rotors and send them out and get them resurfaced. The people that do them locally will actually tell you if it can be done. Today we're actually installing new rotors. We're actually upgrading them, and so we're going to take the whole thing out and just replace it. No need to resurface. So we'll take these pads out. We'll then remove this. There's, again, two bolts in the back. You may not can see, Patrick. I don't know if you can get up in there. And my finger is right on one of those bolts. There's one on top, and then there's one on bottom. And then this whole contraption right here will be removed, and then you can tap the disc rotor out. We'll show you that in a second once I get those removed, and hopefully I won't break any more bolts. All right, so I've loosened the bolts in the back here. Like I said, there's one on top, one on bottom. So far, they've been 14 millimeters, both on the device that holds the caliper and the caliper bolt itself. So we're talking a total of 4 bolts. You want to kind of keep them together so you don't get mixed up on how everything goes back together. If you were to forget, you can use the other side as reference, or take lots of pictures before you take things apart. And we're getting there. And I'll show you exactly what it looks like. So I'm going to put these back in so we don't get them lost, mixed up, or anything like that. Essentially, this goes around the disc, the rotor, and then the caliper goes in here and squeezes on the brake pads. And that's what we're taking off in order to remove this. If you were just doing the brake pads, you could have left that intact and just slipped them out and slipped the new ones in. like I said, it's recommended you always resurface the discs before you start driving. It would not hurt anything other than your brakes may vibrate. And sometimes these suckers can get a little stuck. You may have to tap on them. If they're really stuck, I'll show y'all a trick. There's a little screw here. You can actually put in a bolt that will pop them right here. As you screw it in, it will pop the rotor out. But let's try a little tapping and see how that works. A little gentle. And since we're not using these again, not as critical. All right, guys, so I did not have to use the bolt after all. A little tapping, persuasion, popped right out, and this is what it should look like once it comes loose. Sometimes you get a little bit of little rust and a little condensation forms there, and it just kind of gets stuck to that, but essentially it comes right out. We're going to get the new ones, compare the new parts to the old parts. Let's do that now. Got going on, make sure it matches. Well, guys, as things happen when you DIY, I'm not a mechanic, and these things are going to happen. We had, like I said earlier, a bolt brake. I did order it. They're like $8 at the dealer, so got to be careful, and sometimes these things happen. The other thing we ran into, we had a full kit right here that we ordered for the Miata, rotors, pads, and unfortunately, it turns out these cars come with 2 different suspensions. This one's got the sport suspension. I basically took a gamble and lost, and figured, no, what are the odds I have a sports suspension? Well, I do. So I recommend, if you have a Miata or any car along those lines that has multiple suspensions, get your VIN number, call the dealer, because when I tried to find it, I couldn't find any information. Call your dealer. Your dealer will then tell you what you have and order appropriately. This ended up costing me $40 to return, and because I'm now like $60 into it, between bolts and kit return, we're going to go the cheaper way and resurface the rotors and put in new brake pads up front. The back actually looked good, but I sure would have liked to have upgraded the whole vehicle. But these are things to keep in mind, save money, and it'll be just a second or two for you guys, but for us it's going to be a day or two to get the parts, the brake pads, the rotors, and all resurfaced. So we'll see you soon. All right, we're back, and it's been a day, and we actually had to go to several auto parts stores, and even the first set we ordered, after we found out that we had the wrong set, they still gave us the wrong ones. So apparently there's an issue with some of these auto parts stores, but we finally found them. We got these fancy brake pads that are finally the ones that match, and we just put the rotors back on. They have been resurfaced since we could not find the aftermarket set anywhere, I guess due to the post-pandemic situation with people shipping things. So we resurfaced them. It was about $18 a piece, so I spent about $40, and these cost about $55, and they're ceramic, and we have now cleaned it with brake clean, put them back on. Essentially, we're putting the pads back onto this caliper, and then we're going to reinstall it. I've put a little bit of grease on the clips, as you can see right here, and we're going to slide the pads in and try to keep the you don't want to get any grease on the pads themselves, just on the moving parts where they slide. Just kind of be patient. Let me see if I can get back here on the ground, keeping everything clean. There we go. Just kind of pull on them pads a little to get it lined up and straight. Sometimes pretty easy, sometimes not so much. Here we go. And there it is right there. So essentially one pad's on. We're going to do the same thing to the other side, and then we'll reinstall it. Again, want to keep your pads clean. Get a good view on here. Slide it in. Careful not to break or bend anything. We've already done enough of that. And there they are. And now we install backwards of what we took off. Oh, by the way, we also had talked about breaking one of these bolts. These are the ones that go on the sliders. We have greased them up as well. These locking pins are greased up. Careful not to mess up the boot. And these bolts go in here and attach the caliper onto the car. Gonna find our bolt holes, line them up with the long bolts. Remember, they one on top, one on bottom. Patrick, I don't know if you can see where you're at. I'm kind of blocking. And let me get in here for a second. And again, find the bolt holes, you align them. So again, we'll retighten them. This installs this. Then the brake cylinder there, the caliper, will go on top of this device, which is what compresses the brake pads onto the rotor. So we're pretty much almost there. Again, I've cleaned off the grease, anything that they may have used to resurface them. If you got new ones, they do come oiled so they don't rust. You want to spray them with brake clean. Just give them a good spray on either side. I've seen people put them on backwards, spray them, flip them around, and spray them again. And then, like I said, grease any moving parts, including the pins. Put the bracket on with the two bolts, one on top, one on bottom. We looked up the specs. It said 36 to 51. I found 36 to be about where it was before. I didn't want to over tighten and break another bolt like we did before. So we did it at 36 foot per pounds. So you just get one of these, and you can actually rent them at your hardware store, or you can buy them pretty cheap sometimes, depending on sales, especially this time of year. So we've worked them to 36 pounds. We're going to now put the brake caliper, now that we've put in the bracket on, and as you notice, it will not fit. The pads are on here, they're newer, they're wider, it will not fit. So one of the reasons is we have to push this cylinder in. As it used up the brake pads, it pushed in to the point where it no longer will fit with new brake pads. And that's okay. We can actually use a clamp, or in this case, we can improvise with this and actually push it in. Patrick, I don't know if you can see me pushing it in. And we'll do it gently, slowly. Let me do it this way. I can see better as well. And you see the cylinder, the piston going in. Nice and slow. We're going to push it back in. And it should fit over the new pads now. Let's try it out. Again, you got to be careful how you have this brake hose. You don't want to bust it, put too much strain, and voila, it actually fit right over the new brake pads. We'll take our new bolts that we had issues with before, and I went ahead and got two. As expensive as they are, I didn't want to buy but the one that I broke, but if we had an issue with it being weak, might as well replace them both. Let me get the one on the other side, bottom. We'll align it. And I will see if I can look up the specs for these. I believe these were in the 50 to 60 range, but we're going to make sure. You always want to play it safe. Of course, you don't want to over tighten them, because then you could break them, but you don't want to keep them too loose and then end up having a brake failure. But essentially, once we tighten these to spec, the brakes are done. Now, I did put this lug nut in here to hold the rotor in place while I'm working with it, because if you remember, it just comes right out. This allows me to not have to mess with it and get it dirty, since I've already cleaned it. At the same time, once we torque everything, we'll take this out. It'll be in place now by the brake caliper and bracket, and we can then slip the tire back on, which we'll do in just a second once I look up the specs for the brake caliper, now that we've done the brake bracket. All right, so we pushed the pistons back in as we said earlier. that of course pushed the fluid up. I already went in and pumped the brakes to bring the piston back towards the pads, but still the pads were a lot thicker, and obviously because they're newer than the original that were worn out, so we ended up with a lot of fluid in here. So before we actually went for a test run, after pumping the brakes, making sure that they do grab, and then cranking the car, we removed some fluid. We'll keep an eye on that as well and get it, make sure that it's level. But it's just something to think about. Your brakes, like I said, even if you kept up with them as far as fluid levels, will now have more fluid because the cylinder, that piston is pushed back due to the thicker pads. All right, guys, so we're driving, no issues. Like I said, you want to hit the brakes, take it easy at first, and just hit a few good little easy brakes, and then get harder and harder until you get them nice and hot. And once you do, they'll actually kind of have a smell. You're burning all the contaminants and whatever may be left on the rotors and brake pads, and there's nothing to worry about that, and then you're good to drive. Hope you enjoyed the video.